Chapter 2, Pre-Field. Upon their acceptance to their field team for this assignment, we submitted an application to the agency of which they are members. 1 month later, we found ourselves across the country at our first agency training session. Since Jerry had determined we should take the long-term missionary track, we were given an extensive list of requirements and college courses to accomplish during pre-field. I was absolutely overwhelmed. Much of the training was focused on church planting efforts, not necessarily tools for establishing and running a business's mission to support the national partners' church planting efforts. We took what we could from these trainings. During that week, we had several interviews. Following our final interview, we were commissioned at the annual conference. Jerry flew out from our home sending church to represent us. When we returned home, we had a lot of support raising and studies to accomplish. We hosted many families for dinner to share the project's vision and visited 5 other churches in our area. Not one of these churches made any commitment for monthly support. I was exhausted and disheartened by the time and preparation with so little response. Sometime during our pre-field, we were invited by and transitioned over to a smaller side branch of our agency. This branch was intended for missionaries partnering with an existing national partner, typically in creative access, Christian hostile countries in the East. We agreed and transitioned over to this side of the agency, thinking it had long been established with a successful track record. What we didn't know was the main leader was retiring and bringing on 2 new executive directors into the home office to continue building this smaller organization, piggybacking on the larger established organization. Around this time, Jerry and his wife Janet had us over for burgers and announced he would also be transitioning from Global Outreach Director at our home sending church to this agency, and his wife would be joining as well. We were excited by the news. At least we wouldn't be alone in this endeavor. Our homework assignments began to change because we were this agency branch's first guinea pig family. Jerry and the 2 executive directors began navigating new policies and procedures. We felt caught between the education department's long list of assignments given to us at our first training and the new side branch's cancellation and alteration of what was actually required. It was very confusing. At least the burden of taking 4 different seminary courses was lifted off my shoulders. In between all of this, I was really enjoying this season of drawing close to Jesus during my time at home. Worship music would be on for hours. I would dance and sing, encountering afresh the unbridled, unconditional love of Jesus. I began to sense his presence and spent time listening and journaling what I believed the Lord was saying to me. Bible reading was exciting and regular, and I was hearing short phrases in my spirit as I was waking up in the early morning hours. I had never had a relationship with God like this before, and I was enthralled and eager for more. I wanted so badly to find out what my spiritual gift was and find a place of true belonging in the church. Because I was so passionate about worship and loved singing, I tried leading a couple songs on the women's worship team at Tuesday morning Bible study. When I wasn't asked to lead worship again after those few songs, I felt the bitter sting of rejection. Weeks later, I was finally brave enough to bring it up in conversation with a close friend on worship team. She told me, "You don't have a professional voice." I nodded in agreement, trying to make my heart digest this information too. After that, it didn't take long for me to step down altogether from 3 years of women's worship team, serving on djembe or vocal harmonies. I lost my voice as my hopes were dashed and a piece of my heart got crushed. Continuing pre-field, Chad and I managed to lead a short-term missions trip to Asia with 4 other church members during spring break. We did all the normal serving activities that we had done the year before. This time, however, I recall Heidi was largely absent that week. On the previous short-term mission trip with Jerry, we'd stop by Heidi's home for lunch and tea, relaxing in their place for a while before the next scheduled event for the day. This time we were left sitting on the hard church stage. Then, if we were hungry, we'd have to go out into the busy city to find food with a church staff member. There was no midday rest. The heat alone was sweltering. Heidi also hadn't provided dinner in her home, whereas she previously had dinner ready for the visiting team at the end of a long day of activities. Multiple evenings, our team, hungry and physically spent, was falling asleep on their couch by the time fast food arrived an hour later. It was a stark contrast. That summer, our family traveled cross-country again for another summer of trainings and conferences. Our older two kids were able to participate in a wonderful training for missionary children. Regardless of whether or not Chad and my training directly applied to the Business as Mission project, we were happy the kids had something. Micah, one of the new executive directors, and his wife joined us for the week-long training as they had just moved into town to work in the home office. So we were able to get to know them a little. Finally, after 18 months of completing assignments, reading books, sharing with friends and family, visiting churches and small groups, and support raising, our family was commissioned by our home church. Micah flew over for this special commencement. With Jerry standing right beside me like a proud spiritual father, I sensed I was laying down my life as a sacrifice for the cause of Christ. Something many missionaries feel at their commissioning services, I imagine. I remember shaking and crying that morning on stage, knowing I was being sent out from this body, my church family of 12 years, into uncharted territory and an assignment I, knowingly, would have never accepted. The next day, Chad and I flew to Asia with Jerry to locate an apartment, order a vehicle, and open a bank account. We stayed in Patrick's home for 2 weeks while we searched, selected, and signed a 2-year lease with a landlord. We ordered some basic furnishings for the flat, so when our whole family arrived, there would already be a place for us to land. During the first week of the pre-trip, Jerry also led a meeting between us and Patrick and Heidi, outlining our expectations for the first year. They gave us 2 pages of expectations, with only one pertaining to Patrick and Heidi, as they were to help us orient and acclimate. We weren't aware this was to become an issue, as we were brand new, inexperienced missionaries. Their expectation was in bold type on page 2. Start with weekly team meetings. After a seemingly successful pre-trip, Chad and I returned home and began sorting through all our things, filling our 3-car garage with most of our belongings to sell. This alone was a gigantic task, as every item we owned got touched. We sold our cars and everything else except personal belongings, which we put inside a storage shed. We left basic furnishings in the house to be used as a rental, since we planned to be gone for 2 years, if not more. When it was time for our departure to the field, unfortunately, we ran across trouble with our agency. Their medical director had just retired and a new one was in office. The new medical director didn't know the ropes, and our agency's new executive director, Micah, also didn't foresee that we needed medical clearance. Consequently, our departure was delayed by several weeks, as the hospital downloaded our entire lifespan of medical records onto a CD and snail-mailed it across the country for some sort of approval. While waiting for medical clearance from the agency, our vehicle we flew halfway around the world to purchase had arrived on the lot in Asia and was promptly sold to someone else within a week because we weren't there to pick it up. Talk about frustrating. At least Patrick was kind enough to send one of his staff to our apartment when our furniture arrived. Also, his American wife Heidi was kind enough to make the beds with the sheets we had brought over and put a few groceries in the fridge just before our family's arrival.